The first thing you notice on a hive world is the taste of the air. It clings to your tongue like rusted metal, dense with the breath of uncounted billions who lived and died before you ever opened your eyes. You wake not to sunlight, but to the groan of ancient machinery shifting beneath your hab block, as though the planet itself resents the weight of so many souls clinging to its skin. The walls hum with ceaseless industry, a droning pulse that replaces silence the way Prometheum replaces water. And every morning, as you descend the stairwells carved into the hive like veins, you feel the gravity of lives stacked endlessly above and below you, an ocean of humanity compressed into steel coffins, praying the day won't be the one where the supports fail, the Arbites raid your level, or something in the dark decides you're next. Because on a hive world, something always hungers. The air of the lower hive does not begin as air at all. It becomes air only after passing through. Kilometers of filtration groves clogged with corpse dust, industrial rot, and ancient spores shed by machines that should have been retired before your grandparents' grandparents were born. The first breath always burns. Even after a lifetime spent in these depths, the acidic sting lingers on the tongue, as if reminding you that you were never meant to inhale what the hive exhales. Yet breath is life, and life here is a commodity that leaks away faster than coolant from a fractured pipe. I learned to breathe shallow, keeping my ribs tight, so the stench of corroded metal and bio-waste didn't settle too deeply. But you can never fully escape it. The hive fills you like smoke fills a chimney slowly, relentlessly, until you no longer remember what clean air ever felt like. Our hab block was carved into the hive's crust, a miserable sub-level built upon layers of failed expansions and emergency stabilizers, welded in the dim ages when humanity still believed the galaxy belonged to. Whole sectors groaned when the temperature changed, metal plates bending like tired bones. Sometimes, at night, the walls whispered with shifting strain, and we all held our breath, waiting for the tremor that would turn our homes into tombs. A collapse in the lower hive never makes the news. It simply becomes another sealed zone, another forgotten chamber where workers once lived and died in darkness. You prayed it wouldn't be your level, because prayers were all anyone could afford. The shift gong always came too early. It echoed through the exhaust ducts with a sonorous clang that vibrated the teeth in your skull. That sound was the closest thing we had to morning. No sunbeam ever touched our corridors, only the flicker of malfunctioning lumen strips that buzzed like trapped insects. The gangers had stripped half the lights years ago, selling copper filaments for a handful of ration chits, so most of our path to the manufactorum lay in darkness. I spent childhood memorizing each step, each ladder rung, each drop of condensation where the pipes sweated under strain. One misplaced foot could plunge you into maintenance shafts so deep they might as well open into the void. No one came back from those falls. People talked in hushed tones as we filed through the corridors. The hush wasn't reverence, it was self-preservation. Sound traveled strangely down here. A shout might lure attention from things you didn't want hearing you. Malformed sump lurkers, forgotten servitors still following century-old protocols, or worse, a patrol of hive enforcers already angry before you appeared in their path. Silence was a shield. Silence meant survival. We passed the memorial wall each morning, its steel covered in etched names and rough scratches from blades that had carved final messages during riots or purges. No offerings were left there anymore. Incense was too precious, and candles were a luxury reserved for shrine levels we would never afford to visit. Instead, the wall simply existed, an unblinking testament to the countless who had died nameless. Children touched it for luck as they passed. Adults avoided looking at it too long, afraid they might see a space waiting for their own name. Our manufactorum loomed ahead like the maw of a sleeping titan, its conveyor lines twitching with half-conscious motion. It had no official designation we could pronounce. Administratum workers referred to it through strings of numbers and letters. We just called it the Iron Heart. You could feel the vibrations through the floor long before you saw the vast machinery inside, as though the planet itself pulsed to its rhythm. Clouds of coolant vapor formed ghostly shapes above the assembly pits. Sometimes, if you looked too long, you swore you saw faces in the fog, hollow-eyed, watching, as if the spirits of those crushed in work accidents still lingered to remind us of our place. The shift overseers stood on suspended platforms, their rebreathers hissing like predatory beasts. They watched us enter with bored eyes, tallying our presence through cracked data slates. If someone didn't show up, the overseers didn't ask why. They simply updated the roster and, if necessary, increased quotas. Quotas were sacred, lives were not. My station lay deep within the primary forging chamber where molten promethium exhaust ran through shielded veins, giving the air a permanent taste of scorched oil. My job, like every job in the Iron Heart, was repetitive to the point of madness. With gloved hands and scorched sleeves, I checked the alignment of assembly rods feeding into a press that could crush a man into slurry without slowing. You worked quickly, precisely, and without pause. The machine did not care if your fingers were numb or if your thoughts drifted. It only cared about movement and metal. Any deviation meant a shutdown, and shutdowns ignited the overseer's fury. In the lower hive, there are three things more feared than death: quota, failure, contamination alarms, and Arbeit sweeps. Quota failure happened daily. Someone got tired, or sick, or simply human, and their momentary hesitation slowed the process. The overseer would descend like a vulture, dragging the offender to the reprimand platform. There were no beatings. Those took too long. Instead, the offender's rations were suspended for the cycle. Hunger was the Arbeits of the lower hive, efficient, unquestionable, and unrelenting. People usually died within 3 or 4 cycles of ration suspension, not because of starvation alone, but because weakness attracted predators. Human predators, things living in the ducts, or the machines themselves. Contamination alarms were worse. If the Auspex arrays detected biological anomalies, spores, parasites, heretical microbial signatures, every worker was forced into isolation cubicles, where recycled air tasted like recycled air. You stayed there until the priests confirmed purity. Once, we were locked in for 6 days while tech adepts chanted litanies over malfunctioning sensors. A man in the next cubicle began screaming on the 4th night, clawing at the walls until he went hoarse. We pretended not to hear him because acknowledging panic made it spread. When the doors finally opened, he was gone. The priests gave no explanation, but nothing shattered the hive like Arbeit's sweeps. Their boots thundered through corridors like oncoming executioners. Their visors glowed cold blue, reflecting the terrified faces of every citizen too slow to flee. The Arbeits didn't visit for petty crimes. They came for infractions deemed threatening to order itself: suspected cult activity, unlicensed gatherings, unauthorized machine spirits whispering in the vents. I had seen entire family lines dragged away in a single evening, their habs sealed behind them without ceremony. When Arbeits appeared, you froze, you lowered your gaze, you breathed shallowly, and you prayed quietly, desperately, that their vox grills didn't repeat your name. One evening, after a shift that had left my hands trembling from heat exposure, the hive trembled with a different rhythm, not from machinery, but from footsteps heavy, synchronized. The corridor lights flickered, then steadied, casting elongated shadows across the pipes. People flattened themselves against the walls. Even the sump lurkers retreated, their scuttling fading into the depths. A hush swallowed the air. The Arbeits were marching. I pressed my back against a corroded support beam, heart thudding in my throat, trying to appear smaller. The procession emerged around the bend like a black tide, armored enforcers encased in carapace plates, visors gleaming, shock mauls slung across their armored thighs. Behind them came servo skulls bearing recorders that blinked crimson, cataloging every face, every tremor, every whisper. But the Arbeits were not alone. Walking at their center was a woman in a robe of deep slate gray, the symbol of the Imperial Aquila displayed not as ornament but as judgment. She moved with calm, precision, each step measured, each breath steady. No armor weighed her down, yet the air around her felt heavier than any plated fist. People instinctively bowed their heads, unsure who she was, but terrified that she might look their way. Later, we learned she was an arbitrator marshal sent to investigate whispers of unsanctioned gatherings near the lower water reclamation units. But in that moment, none of us knew. Uncertainty was sharper than fear. She paused, scanning the line of workers. Her eyes were pale, almost colorless, like polished bone. They settled briefly on me, and I felt my stomach drop. I forced myself not to tremble, not to breathe, not to exist. Then, mercifully, her gaze moved on. The Arbites continued their march, and the corridor exhaled as they disappeared around another corner. But the dread they carried lingered long after their footsteps faded. When they finally vanished, conversation resumed in stuttering whispers. Everyone lied, pretending not to speculate, not to fear, not to imagine what their presence meant. But every soul who lived in the lower hive knew the truth. Arbites did not visit without reason, and reason rarely favored us. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay on the narrow cot in my hab, the ceiling dripping condensation that pattered against my forehead like cold fingers. My sister, Jessa, stirred beside me. She was barely 15, yet already exhausted by the weight of survival. She blinked at me with bleary eyes. "They'll come back," she whispered. I didn't answer, because she was right. The next day, rumors rippled through the hive like static. A worker had vanished from Sector 9B. Some claimed he'd been dragged away screaming by unknown men in hooded rebreathers. Others whispered that he had been taken by sump beasts mutated by chemical runoff. But the most persistent rumor was that the arbitrator marshal herself had ordered his removal after a discreet inquiry. No one knew which story was true. In the lower hive, truth bent to fear long before it reached our ears. By mid-shift, the Ironheart shuddered with sudden power fluctuations. Sparks rained from frayed coils, conveyor lines jammed. Overseers shouted litanies of appeasement to the machine spirits. My stomach tightened. When machinery faltered, accidents followed, and accidents rarely spared anyone nearby. I ducked instinctively as a steel plate clattered from an overhead track, crushing a toolbox where a worker had stood moments before. His scream echoed as he jumped clear, arms bleeding. A siren wailed. The overseers barked orders. We scrambled to stabilize the assembly lines, forcing warped components back into alignment. My hands moved through the motions like a desperate prayer. Guide the rod, secure the latch, check the gauge. Sweat soaked through my gloves. Heat baked my skin. The sound of grinding metal filled my ears like a roar. Then the entire forge lurched. The lights flickered violently, plunging us into momentary darkness. The machine spirits howled through the vox lines. Something massive groaned beneath the platform, something deep within the hive's foundation. Workers froze. Overseers shouted contradictory orders. For a moment, the whole world seemed to tilt. Then, as quickly as it started, the trembling eased. But the damage had already been done. A section of the catwalk above tore free, collapsing in a screech of tortured steel. It fell like a guillotine, smashing into the assembly pit and sending shards of metal flying like shrapnel. I dove behind a coolant pipe as debris rained around me. The impact shook the ground. Heat flared. Someone screamed, a high, raw sound that cut through the chaos like a blade. When the dust settled, 3 workers lay crushed beneath the wreckage. The overseers did not call for Medicae. There was no point. Instead, they marked the bodies through their data slates and ordered the rest of us back to work. But something in me changed at that moment. It wasn't grief. Death was too familiar for grief. It was awareness, a realization I had tried to ignore for too many years. The hive did not hate us. It simply did not care if we lived or died. It breathed us in like dust and exhaled us as memory. Yet even that truth paled beside what happened next. Just as we returned to our stations, the klaxons blared again, but not contamination alarms, not machinery failure. This was a tone we rarely heard but never forgot. Arbites breach alarm. The doors slammed shut. Lumen strips glowed harsh red. Servo skulls swooped down, scanning every face, every gesture, every breath. And through the sealed entrance, I heard it. Bootsteps. Measured, heavy, unavoidable. The Arbites had returned, and this time they were not passing through. This time they were here for someone. Someone in this room. Someone who would not walk out alive. The Arbites entered the Manufactorum with the same cold inevitability as gravity, as though their presence was not a choice, but a universal law. The sealed doors parted with a hiss of depressurization, releasing a blast of stale air tinged with the metallic tang of dust older than the hive itself. Workers froze mid-task, tools suspended in trembling hands, while the overseers pretended a calm they did not feel. No one could hide fear from the Arbites. They were trained to see it like heat signatures, to sniff it out beneath the grease and grime that clung to every citizen of the lower hive. Their visors pulsed with dim blue light, reflecting our silent horror. Behind them walked the arbitrator marshal, her expression unreadable, her stride unfaltering. She moved as though she had already judged us all, and merely needed to determine whose sentence would begin first. The servo skulls wheeled through the aisles, casting thin red beams over our faces. Their auspex arrays clicked quietly, like insects testing the air before a storm. The hum of the iron heart diminished as machinery throttled down, forced into stillness by the presence of authority more absolute than any machine spirit's will. For a moment, the entire manufactorum seemed to hold its breath, the fumes hanging motionless above the forges, shimmering like heat mirages. The world shrank to the sound of footsteps, the scrape of boots on steel, the clatter of armor plates brushing together. No one dared whisper. Even the sweat dripping down the back of my neck felt too loud. The arbitrator marshal lifted a small data slate, its screen flickering with runic codes. She scanned the rows of workers with a gaze that swept across us like a blade. I felt it pass over me, brief, sharp, dismissive before moving on. It came to rest somewhere to my left. I resisted the urge to turn my head. Any movement could be seen as guilt. The overseers insisted we hold our positions, though several looked moments from collapsing. They feared becoming collateral. In the eyes of the Arbites, negligence could be as treacherous as heresy. The servo skulls began circling a cluster of workers near assembly line G12. Their beams narrowed, steadying on one man, Callan Orst, a quiet fixture of the forge who had worked there for decades. Callan never caused trouble. He rarely spoke at all. His eyes had long adopted that hollow, distant quality found in those who surrendered to routine years earlier. Yet today, something flickered within them, an emotion I couldn't decipher, fear, resignation, or perhaps something deeper and more dangerous, something the Arbites had come to extinguish. The arbitrator marshal approached him slowly, each step deliberate. Her boots made no sound. That silence felt worse than any metallic clang. When she finally stood before Callan, the entire manufactorum leaned toward her without meaning to, drawn in by the gravity of the moment. She raised her voice just enough to carry, though it remained composed, precise, like a blade sliding from its sheath. Callan Orst, laborer of 9B, you stand accused of disseminating unauthorized materials and participating in unsanctioned discourse regarding Imperial doctrine. You will submit to immediate detainment. No one breathed. Unauthorized materials, unsanctioned discourse. Those phrases were colder than a death sentence. They meant treason of thought, that unseen, invisible form of rebellion the Imperium loathed most. The Arbites did not need proof. Suspicion was enough. They punished possibility, not action. Callan trembled. He opened his mouth, as though words might save him, but nothing emerged. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. The marshal watched him with the patience of a stone statue. When he still failed to speak, she nodded to the nearest Arbites officer. Two enforcers stepped forward, shock mauls humming. Callan's knees buckled. He raised his hands in a futile gesture of surrender, but the Arbites were already upon him. They seized his arms, twisting them behind his back. The room flinched as he let out a choked cry. I bit down on my lip until I tasted blood. This wasn't a punishment. It was an extraction. Clean, swift, final, but something was wrong. The fear etched across Callan's face did not resemble guilt. It resembled realization dawning, terrible, immense. He struggled harder than anyone expected, his voice breaking as he finally managed a word. No. The Arbites drove a fist into his stomach, cutting him off. He collapsed, gagging. Yet in that single syllable, something ignited in the room. A ripple of unease, a question with no safe answer. Why him? The marshal motioned for the officers to lift him. They hoisted him onto his feet, though his legs barely obeyed. He looked across the manufactorum, eyes searching, desperate. They settled on someone in the crowd. though I couldn't see who. A flash of recognition passed through him, a silent plea buried beneath agony. Then he was dragged toward the exit. The heavy doors yawned open again, their hydraulics growling. Beyond them lay corridors where prisoners disappeared into dark vans, into judicial chambers, into cells whose walls absorbed screams as though feeding on them. Once you passed through those doors, you became a ghost, haunting the memories of those who watched you go. No one ever walked back. Just as the Arbites reached the threshold, Callan did something unthinkable. He twisted free of one officer's grasp, not fully, but enough to slam his shoulder into the doorframe. The movement was desperate, sloppy, half-mad. It earned him 2 strikes from shock mauls, electricity snapping through his torso. He convulsed, coughing blood. The workers gasped in unison, then silenced themselves instantly. But the marshal did not strike him. She simply watched. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as though she were analyzing an unexpected data point on a slate. Callan drew a ragged breath. His voice cracked as he forced out a final sentence, barely more than a whisper, yet somehow echoing through the chamber as if carried by something larger than air. "It wasn't me." The Arbites slammed him against the wall, shackling him fully this time. His head lolled forward. The officers moved with renewed force, dragging his limp form through the doors, boots echoing until the metallic clang swallowed them. The doors sealed shut. Silence suffocated the manufactorum. The overseers tried to resume order, barking commands, urging machines back into motion. But their voices held a tremor, an unmistakable waver. For once, they were as frightened as the workers. Everyone had heard Callan. Everyone had seen his terror. Everyone felt the implication. If it wasn't him, then who? I returned to my station in a daze. My hands moved automatically through motions hammered into muscle memory, but my mind drifted, tangled in the aftermath. Callan Orst had been harmless, forgotten, unremarkable. Why accuse him? Why extract him with Arbites force rather than conduct a quiet interrogation? Why bring an arbitrator marshal for a single, aging worker? None of it made sense. Unless the Arbites weren't just hunting one man, unless they were hunting a network, or a rumor, or an idea. The thought hammered at the inside of my skull. The hive was full of whispers, muted, shapeless, impossible to track, stories of forbidden gatherings, wandering preachers muttering litanies the ecclesiarchy disapproved of, claims that machine spirits cried at night, tales of ghostly lights seen near the water reclamation stacks, and lately, something newer, something subtler, hints of a presence moving through the lower hive unseen. Some called it a prophet, others a heretic, some believed it was merely madness created by starvation. But whatever it was, the Arbites were hunting it, and they had started with Callan. Hours passed under the weight of that looming dread. Each clang of metal seemed louder, each hiss of steam sharper. The workers were mechanical in their movements, united by collective fear rather than routine. Overseers monitored us with unusual scrutiny, as though terrified the Arbites might return and judge them next. Even the machine spirits seemed restless, their rumbling stutters sounding almost like murmurs. As the shift neared its end, I spotted something that chilled me deeper than any Arbite's glare. A scrap of parchment. Old parchment, too pale to be waste paper, too smooth to be accidental. It lay half-hidden beneath a conveyor's shadow. Parchment was rare in the lower hive. No one wasted resources on it unless the words mattered. I glanced around. No overseer watched. No worker stood close enough to see. With a subtle movement, I nudged the parchment toward me, using my boot. It slid silently. My heart pounded with reckless curiosity. When the machine cycle paused for a tool reset, I crouched as if adjusting a valve and snatched the scrap, tucking it into my sleeve. Later, during the march back to the hab blocks, I felt its presence like a burning coal against my skin. Jessa noticed my stiffness but said nothing. The corridors around us dripped with condensation, pipes groaning overhead. Lumen strips flickered, stuttering as though struggling to stay conscious. When we reached our cramped hab, I bolted the door and finally unfolded the parchment. My breath caught. The writing was careful, precise, almost reverent. It did not resemble any prayer sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. The words were handwritten, not stamped or printed, and the style felt ancient, almost forgotten. It read, "The light beneath the ash is not extinguished. It waits where the forgotten gather. Seek not the throne above, but the spark below." My fingers trembled. It was heresy. Pure, unfiltered heresy. The kind the Arbites erased entire families for. I nearly tore it apart in panic. Then I saw something else. A mark near the corner. Not an aquila, not a gang sigil. Something unfamiliar, 2 lines intersecting through a circle. A symbol I had never seen, yet felt disturbingly drawn to. A faint noise crackled through the ventilation shaft above me. I snapped my head up. Jessa stiffened. The sound repeated soft, rhythmic taps. 3, then 2, then 3 again. A coded knock. A signal used in the lower hive to announce visitors who wished to avoid attention. I hid the parchment beneath my sleep mat and gestured for Jessa to remain silent. Heart hammering, I approached the grate embedded in the wall. The tapping stopped. A moment later, a voice whispered through the mesh, hoarse, urgent, barely audible. "You took it." My blood froze. The voice belonged to someone I knew, someone who had stood 5 meters from me when the Arbites took Callan. Torvik, a wiry worker from line G12, quiet, thin as a soldering rod, eyes too watchful for his own good. "Give it back," he whispered. My mind spun. If he knew about the parchment, did that make him part of whatever Callan had been accused of? Was he here to kill me, or warn me? "You shouldn't have it," he murmured. "They'll search. They'll come again." My throat dried. I felt the weight of the parchment beneath the mattress, burning like guilt. "What was it?" I whispered back. A pause. Then, so softly, I almost thought I imagined it. "Hope." My chest tightened. No one in the lower hive used that word. Not seriously. Hope was a memory we were punished for entertaining. Hope led to questions. Questions led to defiance. Defiance led to extraction. Torvik continued, voice cracking under strain. "They think Callan wrote it. He didn't. None of us know who did. They just appear. Left in places where the air grows thin. No one's ever seen the writer." A chill ran down my spine. Someone was moving through the hive. Someone with messages that could get us all killed. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe, to think. But the hive seemed to lean closer around me, as though listening. Torvik whispered again, each word drenched in dread. "The Arbites won't stop. They'll tear the whole sector apart if they have to. If they find that parchment on you, you'll disappear like the rest." A distant clang echoed through the corridors outside, heavy and metallic. Footsteps, multiple, approaching. Torvik yanked back from the vent as if scorched. He hissed a final warning. "Burn it!" The grate fell silent. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Boots. Arbites' boots. I froze, terror coiling around my ribs. Jessa clutched my arm, eyes wide with fear she didn't need explained. The footsteps stopped just outside our hab door. A gauntleted hand slammed against the metal, making the walls tremble. "Inhabitants of Unit 34B." A muffled voice boomed through the Vox grill. "By order of the Arbitrator Marshal, open the door for inspection." Jessa looked at me with horror. The parchment lay hidden, but not far enough. The Arbites were here, and they had come for us. The pounding on the hab door seemed to vibrate through my bones, each strike a reminder that the thin sheet of metal between us and the Arbites would not hold for long. The Vox grill repeated its command with mechanical indifference, the filtered voice stripped of humanity and layered with static like a shroud. Jessa clung to my arm, her breath shallow, eyes glistening with fear that threatened to spill over into panic. I loosened her grip gently, not because I didn't want her close, but because I needed both hands free. For a moment I wondered if Callan had felt this same choking dread when they came for him. I imagined him kneeling, gagging for air, staring helplessly at people who could do nothing but watch. That memory carved itself into my mind like a scar. I refused to let this door open with that same inevitability. The parchment beneath the sleep mat throbbed like a heartbeat in the room's stale air. I imagined the Arbites storming inside, weapons drawn, their visors, scanning every corner. They'd tear the place apart, tip the bed, find the heretical scrap, and drag us out by the throat. I pictured the chaos of it, the shock mauls, the boots, the accusation that needed no evidence. The hive had no mercy for people like us. Lives here were measured by usefulness and compliance. Dissenters, or even those near dissenters, were a virus to be excised. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. The Arbites struck the door again, denting the metal inward. My pulse spiked. I shoved the mattress upward, grabbed the parchment, and nearly ripped it in half with trembling fingers. But something in me hesitated. The words radiated an eerie pull, a gravity that refused to be discarded. It wasn't devotion or belief, nothing so dangerous. It was the uncanny feeling that destroying it would somehow change nothing. The Arbites weren't here because of the parchment. They were here because the hive itself had begun whispering. Burning this scrap wouldn't silence a rumor that already had weight. But I couldn't keep it. A vent sat above the bed, narrow, rusted, barely wide enough for a small animal to crawl through. Without thinking, I shoved the parchment into the vent's darkness, listening as it skittered across the metal before disappearing into the labyrinth of ducts. It was reckless, it was desperate, but it was gone. The pounding grew violent. Jessa squeezed my hand, pleading silently for an idea, a miracle, anything. I exhaled slowly and forced my voice steady. "Open it!" Her head snapped up, horror flooding her face. But I knew the Arbites. If they sensed resistance, even imagined it, they would breach the door with shaped charges, tear gas, shock grenades. They'd treat us as insurgents, not citizens. People died like that accidentally, officially, conveniently. I unbolted the door. The moment it swung open, 3 Arbites surged inside, weapons raised. The cramped hab filled instantly with their imposing cams, silhouettes, black armor swallowing the lumen glow. The air grew heavy with the scent of machine oil and ozone. A servo skull floated in after them, its auspex array clicking like the mandibles of some hungry insect. "Stand against the wall," an officer barked. Jessa obeyed so quickly she nearly stumbled. I followed, pressing my palms flat against the cold metal. The marshal herself stepped inside, her presence filling the room with such oppressive authority I felt smaller simply by existing near her. Her visor was off now, revealing stern features carved from absolute judgment. She studied us with a calm that bordered on unnerving. "Routine check," she said. "But we all knew there was nothing routine about Arbites at your door. We are searching for contraband materials linked to an ongoing investigation." The way she said materials made the skin on my neck crawl. 2 enforcers began rifling through our belongings. Not rummaging, violating. They overturned storage crates, inspected lumen fixtures, sliced open the sleeping pallet with mono blades. Strips of synthetic padding fluttered to the floor like pale feathers. Another officer tapped the walls, testing for hidden compartments. The servo skull beeped each time it passed over a corner, the sound stabbing at my nerves. Jessa trembled but kept her eyes down. The Arbites loved fear, they fed on it, but they despised defiance. A clang echoed from the vent. My heart lurched. The enforcer standing beneath it froze, head tilting upward. He tapped the vent grate with his maul. The parchment must have slid farther down the shaft, but the sound of it striking metal still rang like a death knell to my ears. The marshal watched the officer intently. "Open it," she ordered. He pried the grate loose, flakes of rust raining down. He reached inside, sweeping his hand through the darkness. My breath caught as his fingers dragged along the bottom. If he pushed a little farther, he'd find the scrap. Sweat trickled down my spine. He leaned in deeper, stretching as far as his gauntlet allowed. Then he withdrew. "Empty," he reported. I exhaled silently, legs shaking with relief so intense it bordered on dizziness. Jessa's shoulders sagged ever so slightly, but the marshal did not relax. She continued staring at the vent as though listening for the echo of a thought. I wondered if she had developed an instinct after decades of hunting liars, the ability to sense deceit like a hound smells blood. Finally, she turned to us. "You were working at the Iron Heart during this morning's incident," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "You witnessed the extraction of Callan Orst." Another statement, another trap waiting for any deviation. "Yes. Did you see anything unusual before or after the extraction? Anything suspicious? Any exchange that concerns you?" My mouth felt dry enough to crack. The truth would condemn me, a lie might. Condemn me faster. The Arbites didn't need logic, they only needed suspicion. I forced myself to breathe evenly. No, Marshal, nothing. Something in her gaze sharpened, like a scalpel slicing through pretense. She stepped closer until I felt the cold weight of her authority settle over me like a shroud. Understand that withholding information from the Lex Imperialis is a punishable offense, she said softly, and the measure of your fear will not protect you from the consequences, Jessa whimpered. I didn't dare look at her. The Marshal studied me a moment longer, as though reading my heartbeat through my eyes. Then she stepped back. Continue the search. The officers tore through what remained of our possessions, though there was almost nothing left to find. The Marshal walked the perimeter of the room, running a gloved fingertip across the wall. When she reached the small table where Jessa and I shared our ration meals, she paused. Something on its surface caught her eye, a faint smudge of soot from earlier that day when the forge had coughed a cloud of ash so thick it followed me home. The Marshal rubbed the smear between her fingers, examining it with unnerving interest. Sector dust, she murmured. The way she said it made my stomach twist. She might as well have said blood. She wiped her hand clean and turned back toward the door. Nothing of relevance, she concluded. We move. The enforcers filed out, not sparing us a glance. When the last Arbite stepped through the threshold, the Marshal lingered. She faced me again, her expression unreadable, as if memorizing something she intended to revisit. There is a rot in this hive, she said quietly, something that spreads without shape or source. If you encounter anything anomalous, you will report it. She didn't wait for an answer. The door clanged shut behind her with finality. Silence collapsed over the hab. Jessa slumped against the wall and pressed her, hands to her face, sobs shaking her small frame. I embraced her, letting the tremors run their course. It was a long time before she calmed, before the weight of the Arbite's departure stopped crushing our chests. But the danger had not passed. It merely paused. When she finally slept exhausted, curled beneath a torn blanket, I sat awake in the dim light, staring at the vent. The hive hummed around me, a constant mechanical breathing. I thought of Torvik's terrified whisper. I thought of Callan's final words. I thought of the symbol on the parchment, etched into my memory as though carved there, the spark below. In a place like this, hope was not a blessing. It was bait. The following day, the manufactorum was a wound that refused to heal. Workers huddled in small clusters, speaking in low tones before falling abruptly silent whenever an overseer approached. The lines moved sluggishly, spirits dulled by the memory of Callan's extraction and the knowledge that the Arbites had begun their sweep. Even the machines felt different, jangled, shuddering, as though something in their rhythms had been disturbed. Torvik was absent. I scanned the rows of stations until I reached his usual post, half expecting to find new fingerprints of the Arbites there, but there was no sign of him. No one mentioned it. No one dared ask. Disappearances were common when rumors spread like fungus. The hive consumed its secrets, swallowing those who carried them. I tried to work, but my thoughts kept circling around the parchment in the ducts. If I had destroyed it, maybe Torvik would still be safe. Maybe Callan wouldn't have looked at me with those haunted eyes. The overseer's shrill whistle snapped everyone to attention. He waved for silence, his gaunt face pale. By order of the Arbites, he announced, mandatory discipline inspection at shift's end. All workers are to remain in assigned positions. Do not deviate. A collective shudder rippled through the hall. Discipline inspections were a euphemism for interrogation. Physical, mental, sometimes spiritual. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Around me, workers whispered prayers under their breath, some to the Emperor, others to machine spirits, a few to anything that might listen. Hours stretched like molten metal, slow and agonizing. My hands moved of their own accord, repeating the same calibrated motions, but each clang of the forge jarred my nerves. Finally, as the shift wound down, the announcing klaxon blared. We assembled in rigid formation as the march of Arbite's boots echoed toward us. The Marshal returned. Her gaze swept the lines like searchlights across a dark sea. She stepped forward, flanked by two enforcers and a robed figure whose presence sent a new wave of dread through the workers. The figure wore the symbol of the Adeptus Ministorum, not a preacher, an investigator, a confessor. His eyes burned with zeal. The Marshal spoke with clipped precision. Reports of heretical writings in this sector have increased. Someone is disseminating forbidden messages. We will find them. Her visor glinted under the lumen strips, as if reflecting a fire only she could see. You will each recite the oath of purity, the confessor declared, his voice booming with theatrical conviction. Any hesitation will be noted. We began reciting. Voices wavered, some faltered. The confessor paced the line, listening intently. His ears were attuned to fear, and fear was everywhere. When he reached me, he slowed, studying my face with unnerving relish. I forced myself to meet his gaze. His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer. "Have you encountered writings that deviate from imperial doctrine?" he asked softly, close enough that his breath warmed my cheek. My heart pounded so loudly I feared he could hear it. "No, confessor." He held my stare for a long, suffocating moment. Then, with a faint sneer, he moved on. The inspection took hours. When it was finally over, the Arbites dispersed without explanation. Workers sagged with relief, some collapsing to the floor in exhaustion, but I remained rigid, unsettled by something I couldn't name. As I gathered my tools, a piece of folded parchment slipped from behind a coolant pipe near my station. I stared at it, dread and fascination warring in my chest. Another message, left directly for me. I picked it up with numb fingers and unfolded it. Beneath the same strange symbol, a single sentence was written. "You cannot hide from what has already chosen you." The parchment felt heavier than anything made of simple fiber and ink should weigh, as if the words scrawled across its surface dragged on something deeper than gravity. I slipped it into my sleeve before any overseer or Arbite's eye could catch its pale edge. Even the act of folding it seemed dangerous, like bending a blade in my hands. I didn't look at the workers around me. Any glance could become suspicion, any twitch a confession. The manufactorum hummed with the clamor of machinery and fear. People worked faster now, as if speed alone could shield them from attention. I knew I could not stay in the open. The Arbites had returned twice already to this sector, and if someone had slipped the parchment to me in broad sight, they were either desperate or confident. Desperate people get caught. Confident people get others killed. As I moved through the departing crowd, I kept my head low and my steps steady, careful not to make myself memorable. The hive rewarded those who blended into its grime. The ones who stood out were harvested. Returning to my hab was out of the question. Jessa was already on edge. Another intrusion from the Arbites would break her. And worse, if the robed Ministorum investigator appeared again, he would sense the tremor in my voice or the shift in my posture. He would feel the weight of guilt clinging to me like soot, and then both of us would vanish into the darkness where the Emperor's prisons swallowed countless lives without a whisper. Instead, I took the rusted stairwell leading downward instead of upward. Down was always the wrong direction in a hive, but tonight wrong was all I had. The air grew thicker, warmer, saturated with the smell of ancient leaks and dying machinery. The lumen strips dimmed the lower I descended, flickering like veins struggling to maintain a pulse. 1,000 footsteps echoed across the chasm of transit shafts below me, each one a reminder that this place never slept, only shifted its burdens between 20 bodies. I kept moving until the steps ended at a maintenance level that should have been sealed. A broken hazard sign swayed from a single bolt, creaking like it resented life. The door beyond it had been pried open long ago, its frame bent by tools or brute force. That meant people used it, people who didn't want to be found, people like the ones who left messages in vents. I slipped inside. The underhive greeted me with a blanket of oppressive humidity and stale air. Pipes crawled along the ceiling like metallic vines, dripping sludge into stagnant pools below. The entire floor trembled faintly as if the hive's internal organs strained to keep billions alive above. A thin haze floated through the corridors, the byproduct of 1,000 unmaintained vents, exhaling toxins in uneven breaths. A figure stood near a collapsed bulkhead, half hidden in shadow. At first I thought it was a scavenger, but scavengers rarely stood still. They darted, skulked, scavenged with a hungry desperation that defined their kind. This one waited, quietly, intentionally. My instinct screamed to retreat. The figure raised a hand, not as a threat, but as a greeting. In the dim glow, I recognized the tattered sleeve of an off-duty worker tunic. Not an Arbite's ambush, not a gang presence, a worker, someone like me. He stepped forward, revealing a tired but determined face. A deep scar ran from his jaw to his collarbone, still red at the edges as though recently reopened. Beneath that wound lay a younger man than his eyes suggested. Those eyes carried too much knowledge, too much loss. "You came," he said, voice low but steady. "Good." I stiffened. "Who are you?" "A friend." The words sounded brittle, strained by the weight of things unspoken. "Or at least someone who wants you alive. That's close enough to friendship in the Hive. How did you find me?" His expression softened with faint amusement. "You work in the same manufactorum I do. You linger too long near the coolant pipes at shift's end. And you walk like someone carrying a secret too heavy for the spine alone." He pointed to the sleeve where I'd hidden the parchment. "And you're not very subtle." I swallowed hard. My fingers twitched as though preparing to run, but he shook his head. "If I wanted to turn you in," he said, "the Arbites would already be dragging you away. I didn't bring you here to expose you." "Then why?" I asked. He motioned for me to follow. "Because you saw something. Something you must understand." I hesitated, weighing flight against curiosity. But the parchment in my sleeve felt like a hook, pulling me forward. Against better judgment, I walked with him deeper into the underhive. He moved through the tunnels with practiced familiarity, navigating collapsed beams and twisted ducts, as if tracing a map embedded in his bones. Each chamber we passed revealed the underbelly of the Hive makeshift shelters, flickering lumen, globes powered by scavenged cells, clusters of people hunched around cracked heating units, their faces etched with desperation. Children coughed from fumes that would choke a grown man. Old women clutched scrap icons of the Emperor, whispering prayers with cracked lips. In the upper Hive, people died from overwork or failure. Down here, people died from the Hive, simply forgetting they existed. We reached a storage chamber carved long ago from the Hive's foundations. Its metal walls were covered in layers of soot and corrosion, but they had been cleared in one central space. An improvised shrine stood there, candles melted into uneven pillars, pieces of scrap metal shaped into crude symbols, fragments of parchment pinned to the wall with bent nails. I froze as my eyes locked onto one symbol in particular, the same symbol from the parchment, the same as the mark found under the coolant pipe, the same as the one in Callan's trembling hands. I took a cautious step forward. The candles sputtered, casting the symbol in wavering shadows. The worker watched my reaction closely but did nothing to influence it. "This," I whispered. "What is this?" "A truth," he said. "Or maybe only a beginning." I turned toward him, anger flaring beneath the fear. "This is heresy. And you brought me here? You want me executed?" His face tightened with frustration. "If you thought it was just heresy, you would have burned the parchment. You didn't." He pointed to the symbol again. "This is older than the rumor the Arbites chase, older than the messages, older than our manufactorum. It's been appearing across lower sectors for months." "Appearing?" I echoed. "Scrawled on walls, etched into rust, burned into vent ducts, carved into bone. Always unseen by the Arbites at first, always noticed by the workers who vanish next." The hairs on my arms rose. He stepped closer until his voice could drop to a whisper. "You saw Callan's extraction. You heard his words. And you know as well as I do that what he said wasn't madness." I clenched my jaw. The memory of Callan's last moments pressed down on me like a weight. "The spark below," I said. The worker nodded. He wasn't the first to say it. My pulse quickened. "What does it mean?" "That depends on who you ask," he replied. He sat on an overturned crate, resting his elbows on his knees as if recounting something too heavy to stand for. "Some say it's a new cult forming in the depths. Others say it's a pattern in the Hive's systems, a signal from forgotten machine spirits. Some believe it's nothing, just coincidence twisted into fear. But there are those," he paused, swallowing hard, "who believe it's a warning." "From who?" I demanded. "From below," he said quietly, "from deep beneath the Hive. So deep that not even the Arbites enter those layers. So deep that even the Adeptus Mechanicus lets the machinery rust rather than descend." I stared at him, waiting for him to continue, but he let the silence speak, leaving me to fill the void with unfamiliar dread. He nodded toward the symbol again. "Every person who sees this mark ends up involved, one way or another. Those who try to ignore it disappear. Those who investigate disappear. Those who speak of it vanish in ways the Arbites never acknowledge. I stepped back, the realization hitting me like a blow. You brought me here so that I disappear too. He shook his head fiercely. No, I brought you here because someone already chose you. Someone who slipped that parchment into your station. Someone who believes you're part of whatever this is. I'm giving you a chance to choose instead of being forced. Choose what? Between death and deeper death? Between truth and madness? His expression softened with sympathy. You're afraid. I understand. The hive feeds on fear. But fear alone won't protect you anymore. I looked at the symbol again. Its lines seemed almost to shift under the trembling candlelight, bending, opening, revealing some shape I couldn't recognize. Each time the flame flickered, the form changed, like an image in water disturbed by unseen motion. A sound echoed through the corridor beyond the chamber. Footsteps, measured, heavy, inhumanly uniform. The worker and I exchanged a glance. Skitarii. The worker blew out the candles instantly, plunging the chamber into thick darkness. He grabbed my arm and pulled me against the wall just as red targeting lenses swept across the corridor outside. The unmistakable whine of their augmetic limbs reverberated like a warning pulse. Skitarii patrolled the underhive rarely. When they did, it meant something had drawn the attention of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The worker whispered, "They're searching for heat signatures." My breath froze in my chest. The Skitarii paused near the entrance. My skin crawled as their auspex. Arrays hummed. I closed my eyes, praying silently that the faint heat of our bodies blended with the ambient temperature of decaying pipes. Minutes passed like hours. A mechanical voice crackled through a Vox speaker. Negative. Area clear. The steps moved on. Only after the sound faded did I let my lungs take air again. The worker slumped onto the floor, wiping sweat from his brow. "That was too close," he muttered. "What are Skitarii doing here?" I whispered. "That's what terrifies me," he replied. "Whatever this symbol means, whatever this spark is, the Mechanicus is searching for it too. And the Mechanicus never searches without intention or permission." A chill spread through me. The Arbites hunts, the Mechanicus hunts. Rumors spread, workers vanish, all orbiting the same symbol, the same idea, the spark below. The worker rose to his feet again, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You need to leave," he said. "For tonight. Go back to your hab. Pretend nothing happened. But keep your eyes open, and if another message finds you, come back here. Don't ignore it. If you do, you'll end up like the others." I nodded, though dread tightened around my throat like a clamp. As I turned to leave, he added one final sentence. "And remember this. Whatever lies beneath the hive, it's waking." The walk back to my hab felt like crossing an invisible battlefield, one where every shadow held a witness and every flickering lumen a confession. The hive's usual clamor felt muted, muffled beneath layers of rising dread. The underhive's stale humidity still clung to my clothes, and I knew Jessa would smell it the moment I stepped inside. That alone filled me with more panic than the Skitarii patrol. Fear for her had become a compass pointing always toward danger, but I did not have another path. The ascent through the maintenance levels scraped at my nerves. I reached the Hab Spire's service corridor just as the shift change sirens blared across the sector. Workers stampeded through the main hallways like cattle driven by fire, but I stayed in the quieter passages, letting the tide pass me by. When the crowd thinned, I slipped into the narrow stairwell leading to my Hab block. My legs trembled slightly. Even the concrete steps seemed aware of secrets pressed between my ribs. By the time I reached my hab, the lumen above the door flickered its dying light across the peeling paint of our number. I stood still for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. If Jessa saw the terror I carried, she would demand answers, and answers would mean truths I could not safely speak. I keyed the panel. The lock hissed open. Jessa stood inside, arms folded, a cracked teacup resting in her hands. Her eyes went wide the moment she saw me, not with relief, with fear. "Where were you?" she whispered. Her voice trembled so subtly that I almost missed it. Jessa was not someone who trembled. She endured ration cuts, Arbeits inspections, and manufactorum accidents without letting her voice break. Yet now it trembled. I stepped inside and sealed the door behind me. I stayed after the shift, I said, forcing calm, clearing a jammed pressure valve. It took longer than expected. The lie floated between us like toxic vapor. Jessa did not believe me. She set the teacup down. The sound of ceramic against the metal table felt too loud in the small room. They came again, she whispered. Cold needles stabbed through my spine. Who? The Arbites. She looked at the floor, as if ashamed for even saying the word. They questioned everyone in the block. They were looking for signs of something. She swallowed hard. They asked if you've been acting differently, if you've been leaving at strange hours. My pulse hammered. What did you tell them? Her eyes finally met mine. They glistened with a mixture of terror and faith I did not deserve. I told them you were loyal, she said. I told them you were a good worker, that you would never hide anything. I told them everything they wanted to hear. Her voice cracked. And then I prayed to the Emperor that I wasn't lying. I felt something inside me collapse, quietly, like a floor giving way beneath damp wood. I crossed the room and held her. She leaned into me, shaking with silent sobs she would never let anyone else see. I wished I could pour truth into her without destroying us both. Instead, I held her until her breathing steadied. When she finally lifted her head, her expression hardened into something fierce. "Tell me I didn't lie," she whispered. "Tell me you're safe." But I could not lie twice in the same breath. Instead, I brushed her hair back gently and whispered, "I'm home." It was not a promise. It was barely even reassurance. But in the hive, sometimes the only truth that mattered was the one you could survive saying aloud. She nodded, though her eyes still held storm clouds. As she prepared for her rest cycle, I sat on the floor, pulling the parchment back out. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear its fragile fibers. Under better light, the symbol seemed even more intricate than before. The lines formed a shape that defied easy interpretation, somewhere between script and sigil, part industrial, part organic. It reminded me of a star seen through warped glass, or perhaps a map of something too vast or too deep for the human eye to grasp. Beneath the symbol, a small phrase had been written in ink so faint it barely rose above the parchment's texture. "The spark endures." My throat tightened. Endures what? Endures where? Before I could dwell further, a sound echoed through the ventilation shaft above the bed. Not the usual metallic groan of the hive's aging bones. No, this was deliberate. A scrape, a soft click, something being placed. Jessa stirred in her sleep, but did not wake. I rose slowly, as if sudden motion might draw unwanted attention. I climbed onto the bed and reached up, fingers brushing against the cold metal grate. A small object rested just behind the slats. Another message. My breath thinned. I slid the grate open just enough to retrieve it, a folded piece of dark cloth, stitched with symbols I did not recognize. The fabric smelled of dust and machine oil, as if stitched in secrecy beside dormant engines. I unfolded it. It was embroidered with the same symbol, only now it had changed. Or rather, the version before me was more complex, more detailed, as though the first had been a child's sketch, and this was the matured form. The lines spiraled like conduits funneling light. Layers intersected, forming a shape that almost pulsed in the dim glow. There was also a second phrase stitched beneath in red thread. "When the hive trembles, descend." My heart hammered so loud I feared it would wake Jessa. The hive trembled every day, but tonight, I felt something different, a vibration beneath the floor, subtle but persistent. As if something deep within the foundations shifted in its long slumber, I lowered the cloth. And then the lumen over the door flickered out. In the sudden darkness, I heard a distant sound rising through the ventilation shafts. A low hum, mechanical, rhythmic. Unlike any machinery of our manufactorum, the sound grew, louder, until even the walls seemed to vibrate. Jessa jolted awake. "What's happening?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the hab trembled. The tremor rippled upward, shaking dust from the ceiling. Not the violent lurch of a quake. No, this was controlled, mechanical, purposeful. A thought returned from the underhive. Something below is waking. The Vox unit mounted on the wall crackled to life. Static hissed like a warning breath. Then a voice, distant, distorted, speaking through a channel that was not one used by our spire, a voice that should not have been able to broadcast to us, a whisper. The spark endures. Jessa clutched my arm. Turn that off, turn it off. I tried, but the controls were dead, unresponsive beneath my fingers. The whisper continued, threading its way through the static like an echo returning from impossible depths. Descend. A sound thundered through the sector, an alarm, but not one I had ever heard. It wasn't the shrill whine of Arbite's enforcement or the booming clang of Manufactorum emergency. This alarm was lower, older. It rattled through the metal like a voice from the hive's own ancient heart. Jessa's voice shook. Is it an attack? I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My thoughts were already falling back through the layers of the hive, tracing the path to the chamber where the worker had shown me that secret shrine. The candles, the symbol, his final words. Whatever lies beneath the hive, it's waking. The alarm blared again, reverberating across the block. The lights flickered back on but burned a deep red, casting our hab in the glow of an execution chamber. Then a new sound pierced the air. Gunfire. From below, from the direction of the maintenance levels. Jessa's eyes widened with terror. We have to get out. Where? I asked, unable to keep the dread from my voice. The Arbites will block the upper corridors. The underhive is. I didn't finish the sentence, because even through the walls, I sensed something rising from the depths. Not a person, not a machine, a presence, a pressure that pressed against the metal itself, bending it inward like a held breath. And then I heard footsteps in the hallway, not rushing workers, not stomping Arbites' boots, measured, heavy, inhumanly uniform, Skitari. Jessa grabbed my hand. Panic surged in her grip. They're coming for us. I knew the truth she would not want to hear. They were. The Skitari steps stopped outside our door. The shadow of a targeting array swept across the frosted panel. Jessa whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. A mechanical voice spoke through the door's Vox grill. Citizen identification required. I held her close, heart pounding hard enough to bruise bone. The Skitarii did not speak to doors. They broke them. Their presence here meant the Adeptus Mechanicus had marked someone in this hab. Me. The door lock clicked as override codes forced it to disengage. I made my decision in the space of a single heartbeat. I grabbed Jessa, pulling her toward the ventilation shaft. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but she was small, and I had always been desperate. I kicked the grate loose with one brutal strike and shoved her inside. Wait, what about you? She cried. I'll follow. Just go. Now. Her eyes filled with fear and helplessness, but some part of her still trusted me. She crawled into the shaft, disappearing into darkness. The door began to open. I yanked the grate closed and stepped back just as a red scanning beam sliced across the room. The Skitari stepped through the doorway, chromium limbs gleaming under the emergency luminance. Their weapons hummed, micro-servos shifting in deadly anticipation. I froze. The lead Skitarius tilted its head, analyzing me with cold precision. You will come with us. My throat constricted. Why? The spark has marked you. My veins turned to ice. The parchment, the cloth, the messages. Someone had marked me. Someone who understood the depths. Someone who moved unseen. Someone who could slip messages through vents and weave symbols into the hive's forgotten bones. Before I could reply, the hab shook again, violently this time. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The lumen flickered. And then a sound rose from the depths. Not mechanical, not human. A resonance. A low, powerful hum that vibrated through the floor, rising through every level of the hive like a pulse from something immeasurably vast. The Skitarii reacted instantly, weapons shifting orientation toward the floor. Their lenses flared, flooding the room with red. I used that fraction of a second. I ran. I sprinted toward the open hatch, vaulted over the bed, and dove through the ventilation grate. The cramped shaft scraped my shoulders as I crawled as fast as my body would allow. Behind me, the Skitarii opened fire, their shots scorching the metal only inches from my feet. I scrambled deeper into the shaft until the sounds of their weapons faded into the hum rising from below. After several minutes of crawling, I dropped into a maintenance tunnel. Jessa stood there, trembling, waiting for me. Her eyes widened in relief and terror. "What now?" she whispered. I stared into the pulsing red shadows stretching deeper into the hive's bowels. The hum reverberated through the tunnels like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. There was only one answer. "We descend," she swallowed. "Why?" I looked at her, the truth finally settling like ash on my tongue. "Because something chose me. And whatever it is, it's waiting below." We stepped together into the trembling darkness of the hive's ancient underlayers, and the spark below answered.